Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 107th video in our Master Series and the third video in our mixing phase. Really quickly, I want to address something. This is a matter of dynamics. So, whenever you're dealing with dynamics, that you may, depending on how much you're trying to compress your production, that at the end of the production, after you've mixed everything, you may take a maximizer or a compressor or something like that and try to compress it down so it's a little squished. You've seen some productions that come out, they just look really squished, and it's like up to a point where it's not saturating and distorting really bad. And the amount that you can squish things will really depend on the production. Some things you can squish more than others before they start sounding really bad. So it's something to really keep in mind. But a really recommended technique that I recommend is that if you plan on doing that, if you've done everything I've said so far, you should have some pretty good tracks to work with. That doesn't mean that in some productions that I might not squish the heck out of things. Like if something goes into this heavy metal thing and I want a really super compressed sound, that I'm going to do some compression. And it might look like it's, been through a trash compactor when I get done with it. But that's what it sounds great like that. And that's okay. And that can happen in various degrees with different productions. It's not always just about getting maximum loudness out of the whole production. It can also be a sound. If I really squish something up, and I really do a lot of heavy compression on it, it's going to change the sound of the production. So it's a viable thing besides the volume wars and things like that, which there's a video on my channel about that is a viable application in audio engineering when you're dealing with music in lesser in sometimes in large amounts, sometimes in some there in different varying degrees to achieve the sound that you want for your production. And that takes experience, understanding if I do this much, that it's going to have that effect. If I do a little more, if I do a little more, if I do a little more. Now, when you're doing that on a whole production, the whole mix, you're going to have a different effect, because basically if you do it on the whole mix, the problem is you bring everything from the sound floor up, all the noise and saturations and distortions and all that stuff in the lower end of the decibel range, in the the lower end. And also it starts reducing the dynamic range between things. So you also squish the drums and the bass and everything that had dynamic separation in the volume levels closer together. So it has an effect. Now, that is a viable option. But also a better way that I've found to do this is to do this with the individual tracks. So as you get more experienced, you will understand how much you can do this to the individual tracks before you ever start mixing them together. So let's say that I've gone, and it's going to be fairly heavy compression. Well, anyway, before I get to that this can be in varying degrees. So you might do it a little bit on all your tracks to try to reduce the dynamic range of some. You might do it a little bit more to all your tracks to reduce the dynamic range a little bit more. You might do a lot more to reduce the dynamic range a lot more, or you might do it a lot to really reduce the dynamic range and really squish things together. Now, the key here is that if you do that to the whole production, you squish everything together. Here's a cool thing. If you do it to each one of your different tracks, let's say that I've got this guitar track right here. This is the way it normally looks. I've normalized it to where it's pretty much right below peaking right here. Now, if I squish the heck out of that, and I've squished it to the point to where it's caused a little bit of saturation, distortion, you can do it in more and more and more, or in less and less and less and to less degrees. The different amounts of it will have a different effect. But on this one, I squished it quite a bit. And the cool thing in here is if I did this to all my tracks, now the guitar part is going to be, let's say if you look at this like it's laid out on a piece of paper, to where you've got this level right here, 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 and so on and so forth, that I can bring this guitar up to this level And then this squished bass, I can bring up underneath it and bringing it up quite a bit closer to it to where it'll still sound like it's squished, but underneath the guitar to preserve dynamic range a little bit differently when you're heavily compressing things. I hope that made sense, because basically you'll end up with compressed tracks but in layers. Bringing one underneath the other like that, you can bring them closer together and it will sound like you've preserved the dynamics of the production more. Does that make sense? So that you didn't squish the whole production, you went back to the individual tracks and did the amount of compression you're going to do on them, sometimes real heavy, to get the effect that you want of some type of production. So it's a really cool way to achieve that squish sound, to really have that happen, and to be able to preserve dynamic spacing so that the vocals got this much space up towards the top, the guitars got underneath there, a dot, 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 so on and so forth, but they're really squished a lot closer together, because it'll have a different effect than if I squish these two together. You see the dynamics happening in this and the dynamics happening on my front vocal or any other track. If I start just squishing the whole thing down together, it starts squishing them together. So all of a sudden these parts start getting right on top of these parts, but these parts are lower than this part in the vocal, and you start getting some conflicting things happening sometimes that you'll have to really go back and fuss with automation or just not care about and say, well, that's my squished production. I hope I made that clear so you can understand the difference of that, because this will just take all these tracks that say they're like this or like this and so on and so forth, and it'll start squishing them together, the dynamics of them, which can really convolute it. You know, and not only does it bring up the saturation, noise, and distortion, but you don't really have any control of any of the instruments being on top of each other. It just starts squishing them together like a trash compactor, which can be great in some circumstances, but a cleaner way to do that is the way that I'm saying there, because that way I've got all my tracks and I've squished all of them down about the same amount. Maybe not the same amount depending on how they sound, but let's just say it's a production I want to do some heavy compression on the whole thing. So I've done heavy compression on all those tracks, but I've got this track I want on top, I want this other track down below it a little bit, I want this other track down below that one a little bit, I want this other stuff down below that a little bit. You can still achieve that, and it will be audible, and it will sound like you've done this really cool compression algorithm to your production, because you've done it separately on all the individual tracks rather than compress all of them together, which has a little bit different effect. This is a much cleaner way to do it and still have your production come out sounding like you've done those quite a bit of compression sometimes to a production. And on productions you want less compression on, you can do quite a bit of that and then bring those tracks up underneath each other in layers like that, and it make it sound like you did a much better job of, wow, it's like the production sounds a little compressed, but it's really preserving the dynamics also, and you get a little bit fuller sound in production, and people will perceive it as louder when they're trying to squish things, but sometimes it makes it come out sounding fuller because the spectral range is squished closer up to an even level so that it makes the production sound like it's got a fuller spectral content throughout the production. So it can have that added effect also. So keep that in mind and make some notes about that. And the only key thing about that I really want you to take into consideration is whatever track is going to be on top of everything else, back off that one a little bit. Let's say you're really doing a heavy compression job on this production. On the top thing that's the vocals or the guitar lead or whatever, back off on that a little bit. Let that one have a little bit more dynamics. Does that make sense? Let it jump up a little bit, because it will add a more three-dimensional effect. It'll come out making it sound like your production is pretty heavily compressed, but that out front track is going to preserve more of its dynamics that will reflect on the production, sounding like somehow you preserve this dynamic range, but still compress the heck out of it for certain applications, or did a really good job of, a median compression, on the production, but still somehow preserve the dynamics because their ears will be focused on that out front instrument, whether it's a vocalist or guitarist. And if they hear dynamics going on, they're going to assume that you applied that same algorithm to everything, which is normally what happens. So it's refreshing sound that the out front track's really preserving its dynamics where everything else may not be, but it has the effect on the listener that the listener's perceived that the dynamics have been preserved because he's listening, he's focused on that out front track that you haven't done as much compressing to and tried to preserve the dynamics a little bit more. Where the rest of it you might have compressed a lot and started layering those tracks so that get them as close to as you can to each other, because you have this nice flat line to work with that for the most part that instrument's going up to there. The other instrument would be below it, and you can get it a lot closer and still sound like this instrument is on top of the other one. Does that make sense? Which gives the illusion of more dynamics in your production and still being able to achieve compression, and sometimes extreme compression. And this is great even on, productions that you might not want to do that compression on, that's going to add more fullness to it. Because like I said, sometimes that effect also makes the production sound like it's got fuller harmonic content because of you squishing it. You can go, well, not only does it sound squished and louder, but I'm perceiving more harmonic content. I mean, it's because it's squishing everything closer together so that the high, mids, and low ranges in the frequency realm aren't getting escaped because they're a part of the bass or part of the piano or the guitar or wherever, that they get squished close together. So it gives the illusion of there being more harmonic content, a fuller, richer sound of harmonic content in the production. So it basically can help your production in a couple different ways. And the problem with it is, old way of doing it, of just squishing the whole production, can have some bad effects also, bringing up the noise floor, saturation, distortion, and plus it compresses a little bit differently, so it just starts squishing things together, so you get really no dynamic range at all happening at all. Because it's a lie that people did, were happy with the compression of squishing things just because it was louder. They were happy with it because not only is it louder, but it sounds like it's fuller in harmonic and spectral content. So really keep those things in mind. If you really keep those things in mind, that you work on being able to do it in various degrees, can help any production sound thicker, richer, and fuller and lusher. With no argument, it will help in that area. And depending on if you do it a little bit and if you do it a lot, it can really help a production that you really want to squish the heck out of and make it sound thicker, richer, and fuller, but being able to have some separation in decibel range between, to have some layers between the instruments to preserve some, to make it still, it'll come out and sound like it's still preserving some of the dynamics. And on top of it, that the technique that I talked about not squishing the top layer quite so much, because if you've really, an example, if you've really squished the heck out of all the other tracks like this or something and didn't squish the heck out of the top one as much, the listener will be listening to that more than anything else because it's out front on top, and it will give the illusion of your production maintaining more dynamics but still getting a nice loud sound and sounding a lot thicker, lusher, and fuller of what's behind it. So I hope I made that really clear, because I've not really seen this taught ever much, but it is a very viable way to approach in mixing to help in those areas that I've just spoken about, if and when applicable, and in various degrees can be applied to almost any production to help it out. So I certainly hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you in the next video, and I promise we will actually be doing some mixing. See you in the next video.